The Analog Hammer. Chapter 1. The Perfect Silence. The void of space was usually silent, but within the corridors of Mining Station 88, the silence had become a physical weight. Moments ago, the station had been a humming hive of activity, glowing with holographic displays and the soft whine of fusion core stabilizers. Then, the Valari arrived. They didn't fire a shot. They simply exhaled a perfect silence, a high-frequency, wide-spectrum electromagnetic pulse that didn't just scramble electronics. It rewrote the laws of digital physics within a 10-mile radius. In an instant, the lights died. The life support systems choked. The smart locks froze. The station was supposed to be a tomb.
Sweep the sectors. Ensure no biological remnants remain. The humans are likely already suffocating in their own high-tech coffins.
Exarch Val's voice crackled, not through a radio, but through the vibrating filaments on his neck, his forearms shimmering in the pale starlight, filtering through the viewports. He stepped onto the deck plating, his elegant pearlescent boots making no sound on the metal. To him, this was a cleanup operation, a walk through a graveyard of primitive ambition.
Critical. Error. Sys. Failure. Reboot. Impossible.
The station's central AI groaned one last time, its voice a digital rasp coming from a dying speaker overhead, before falling into a permanent, static-filled sleep. Val ignored it. He motioned for his soldiers to move forward, their energy blades glowing with a faint violet light, the only powered tech still functioning in the dampening field.
Path clear. The bridge is ours. These creatures cannot even open their own doors without a computer to hold their hands.
The Exarch sneered, his neural filaments pulsing with a superior blue light. But as they rounded the corner into the primary engineering bay, Val stopped. He didn't see anything at first, but he felt it. A low-frequency vibration. It wasn't the hum of a reactor. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thumping. A sound of metal hitting metal. Thump hiss. Thump hiss. From the darkness of the lower catwalks, a flicker of orange light appeared. It wasn't the clean glow of a plasma cell. It was the messy, flickering dance of a chemical flame.
Pressure's holding, Sarge. She's an old beast, but she don't need a motherboard to burn oil,
whispered Tech Private Sarah Miller. She was crouched by a massive, rusted iron cylinder, a 20th century emergency diesel generator, pulled from a museum or a scrap heap. Her face was covered in thick black grease, her eyes reflecting the fire from a handheld Zippo lighter she held with steady fingers.
Good. Give 'em the welcome party.
Sergeant Elias Thorne stepped out of the shadows. He looked like a relic of a forgotten age. He wasn't wearing the sleek white polymer armor of the station's security. He wore heavy canvas, reinforced with plates of hammered steel. In his hands, he didn't hold an arc rifle or a phase pistol. He held a Winchester 1897 pump-action shotgun, the wood of the stock scarred and worn.
Identification required. Stay where you are, biological. Your technology is neutralized. You are resisting the inevitable.
Val shouted, raising his energy blade. The violet light illuminated the sergeant's face, catching the jagged scar on his jaw. Thorne didn't flinch. He didn't try to hack the alien's shield. He didn't look for a terminal. He simply racked the slide of the shotgun. The sound, a sharp, mechanical clack-clack, echoed through the silent hall like a thunderclap.
My tech ain't neutralized, Sunshine. It's just too stupid to know it's supposed to be dead,
Thorne said, a grim smile touching his lips. He leveled the barrel at the Exarch's chest. The Valari's phase armor began to shimmer, preparing to dissipate an energy bolt that would never come.
Miller, kill the lights, the real ones,
Thorne commanded. Miller pulled a heavy iron lever. With a screech of unlubricated metal, a massive steel shutter slammed down over the viewport, cutting off the starlight. The engineering bay plunged into total pitch-black darkness, save for the tiny orange glow of Miller's cigarette.
Fools! We see in the infrared. Your darkness is no shield.
Val screamed, his voice rising in pitch as he signaled his troops to fire. But as the Valari switched their neural vision to the thermal spectrum, they saw nothing but a blinding, white-hot fog. Miller had cracked a steam pipe. The room was filling with thick, scalding vapor that scrambled the aliens' sophisticated sensors. Then came the roar. It wasn't the pew of a laser. It was the violent chemical explosion of gunpowder. A flash of fire lit up the room for a fraction of a second, and a lead slug, traveling at supersonic speeds, slammed into the first Valari soldier. The phase armor, designed to vibrate at the frequency of light, was useless against 3 ounces of solid lead. The alien's chest cavity didn't dissipate. It shattered like glass.
What is this? What is that noise? My shields, they did not activate.
Val shrieked, stumbling back as the smell of burnt cordite and raw diesel filled his sensitive nostrils. It was a foul, primitive stench that made his skin crawl.
That's the sound of physics, Exarch. No software, no updates, just a spring, a pin, and a very angry piece of metal.
Thorne's voice moved through the steam, impossible to pinpoint. Another clack-clack echoed. Another roar of fire. Another Valari fell, his pearlescent skin stained with the dark blue ichor of his own life force. Val realized then that the perfect silence hadn't trapped the humans in the dark. It had trapped the Valari in a world where their elegance was a weakness and their sophistication was a death sentence. The humans hadn't been defeated by the lack of power. They had been waiting for the lights to go out so they could start the hunt.
Miller, keep that engine turning. We've got a lot of lead to deliver and only one way to ship it.
Thorne growled, his boots heavy and rhythmic on the steel floor. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of a predator that didn't need a computer to find its prey. Chapter 2, Kinetic Truth. The thick, white steam from the ruptured pipes turned the engineering bay into a ghost realm. For the Valari, whose civilization was built on the precision of light and data, this environment was a nightmare. Their infrared sensors were blinded by the heat, and their motion trackers were overwhelmed by the swirling vapor. In the center of this chaos, Sergeant Elias Thorne moved with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life in the mud. He didn't need a HUD. He had his ears, his skin, and the memory of the deck plates beneath his boots.
Form a circle. Overlap your phase shields. It is just one biological. He is using chemical explosives.
Exarch Val's command was strained, his neural filaments flickering a frantic, jagged purple. His soldiers moved to comply, their forearms working in unison to project a shimmering wall of energy. They expected a volley of plasma or a beam of coherent light. Something they could reflect, something they could understand.
Miller, throw the sun now.
Thorne's voice was a low growl, barely audible over the hiss of the steam. From the darkness of a ventilation duct, Miller didn't throw a high-tech flashbang. She threw a simple, heavy glass jar filled with magnesium shavings and a slow-burning fuse. The jar shattered against a Valari shield. A split second later, a blinding, raw white light erupted. It wasn't a digital pulse. It was a violent chemical reaction. The Valari, whose eyes were evolved for the soft glow of nebulae and filtered light, screamed as the magnesium fire seared their retinas. Their shields, designed to stop energy projectiles, did nothing to block the primitive brilliance of burning metal.
My eyes! The light! It is burning my filaments. I cannot see the weave.
One of the Valari soldiers shrieked, dropping his energy blade. The weapon hissed as it hit the oily floor, its safety protocols failing in the absence of a stable neural link. Clack, clack. The sound was the only warning. Thorne emerged from the steam, 5 feet away from the blinded alien. He didn't use a targeting computer. He looked down the simple iron sights of his Winchester. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, a familiar, grounding ache, as he pulled the trigger. The heavy lead slug tore through the air, carrying the momentum of a falling mountain. It struck the Valari's phase armor. The armor tried to vibrate, to phase the projectile into a different energy state, but the slug was too massive, too slow, and too physical. The armor shattered like a frozen pond. The alien was thrown back 10 feet, hitting a bulkhead with a sickening crunch of brittle bone.
One down. Who's next for a history lesson?
Thorne said, his voice cold and steady. He ducked behind a massive steel piston just as a desperate Valari soldier fired blindly with a phase pistol. The purple bolt of energy struck the piston, splashing harmlessly against the foot-thick solid iron. Thorne leaned out and fired again. Another roar, another flash, another alien falling to the floor.
Sarge, the shutter's jamming. One of those glow sticks hit the manual winch.
Miller shouted from the control balcony. She was wrestling with a massive iron crank, her muscles straining against the weight of the emergency blast door. A stray energy bolt had melted the outer gears, fusing the low-tech mechanism.
Warning. Manual. Override. Obstructed.
The station's AI flickered to life for a microsecond, the dying gasp of a backup battery before the speakers melted into static. Thorne glanced up. 2 more Valari were closing in on Miller's position, their energy blades raised high.
Miller, get the hammer. Forget the winch. Break the lock.
Thorne yelled, his voice rising over the sound of the diesel generator. He didn't have time to help her. He had to keep the Exarch busy. He lunged forward, not firing this time, but using the heavy, steel-capped butt of his shotgun as a club.
Get away from me, Primitive. You are a monster, a relic.
Val hissed, swinging his 4 arms in a desperate attempt to catch Thorne. The Exarch was fast, his movements graceful like a dancer's, but he lacked the raw, desperate strength of a human fighting for survival. Thorne took a hit to the ribs, the blow from the alien's lower arm cracking a bone. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The adrenaline, that ancient human drug, was screaming through his veins. Thorne grabbed Val by his shimmering neck filaments and slammed him into a steam pipe. The heat sizzled against the alien's skin. Val shrieked, a sound like tearing metal.
We might be relics, Val, but you forgot one thing about old tools.
Thorne whispered into the Exarch's ear, his breath smelling of coffee and tobacco. He shoved the barrel of the shotgun against the alien's chest.
They're built to last. You're built to be replaced.
Above them, a deafening clang echoed through the bay. Miller had ignored the controls and swung a 20-pound sledgehammer directly onto the fused gear. With the sheer force of the impact, the jam broke. The massive steel shutter slammed shut the rest of the way, sealing the engineering bay and cutting off the Valari's only escape route. The room was now a tomb of iron and steam, and the humans were the ones with the keys. Chapter 3. The Manual Override. While Sergeant Thorne kept the Valari busy in the main engineering bay, Tech Private Sarah Miller was crawling through the guts of Station 88. The air in the service conduits was cold and smelled of stagnant coolant and old dust. Without the environmental processors humming, the station was beginning to shed heat into the void. Miller's breath came in ragged white plumes. Her hands, slick with grease and chilled to the bone, gripped the rungs of a manual ladder. She wasn't headed for a computer terminal. She was headed for the primary oxygen scrubbers.
Just a little further, Sarah. Just a few more bolts between us and not suffocating in the dark.
She whispered to herself, her voice a tiny rasp in the oppressive silence. She reached the life support hub, a circular room filled with massive tanks and a labyrinth of copper piping. In the center stood the primary control console, a sleek white slab of Valari integrated tech that had been upgraded during the peace years. Now it was a dead piece of glass.
Oxygen levels 3% critical.
The station's backup Vox unit stuttered from a wall speaker, the voice distorted as if it were drowning. Miller ignored the console. She dropped to her knees in front of a heavy iron plate bolted directly into the floor. This was the manual bypass, a primitive safety feature the Valari architects had tried to remove 3 times, claiming it was aesthetically displeasing. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine filled the room. A Valari seeker drone, a sleek, floating orb of chrome and violet light, drifted through the open hatch. Its underside pulsed with a hacking beam, searching for a wireless port to interface with.
Accessing. Network. Unable to locate. Protocol. Where is the interface?
The drone's synthesized voice echoed, sounding almost confused. It hovered over the dead console, its light flashing rapidly as it tried to negotiate with the fried circuitry. It didn't even notice the human on the floor.
You're looking for a door that isn't there, you shiny piece of junk.
Miller muttered. She grabbed a heavy, 2-foot-long adjustable wrench from her belt. She didn't try to hack the drone. She didn't try to scramble its signal. She simply stood up and swung the heavy steel tool with every ounce of strength in her shoulders. The sound of the impact was a satisfying crunch. The wrench smashed through the drone's delicate outer shell, sending sparks and sapphire-colored fluid spraying across the room. The drone spun wildly, its anti-gravity drive failing, before slamming into a tank and sparking out.
Error. Physical. Interference. Logic. Breach.
The drone sputtered before its light faded into gray. Miller didn't wait. She turned back to the iron plate. The bolts were rusted shut, fused by years of neglect in the perfect station. She grabbed her sledgehammer, the one she'd used on the shutter gear, and took a wide stance. Clang! The sound vibrated through the floor, into her boots, and up her spine. The first bolt didn't budge. Clang! The second strike sent a shower of rust flying. On the third strike, the bolt sheared off completely, flying across the room like a bullet.
Come on, give it up, you stubborn piece of iron!
She grunted with every swing. This was percussive maintenance in its purest form. To an alien, it would have looked like a barbarian attacking a god. To Miller, it was the only way to save 300 lives. Finally, the plate buckled. She shoved a crowbar into the gap and heaved. With a scream of complaining metal, the cover popped off, revealing a giant red-painted iron wheel. This was the mechanical link to the oxygen tanks. No sensors, no software, just a threaded rod and a rubber seal. Miller grabbed the wheel. It wouldn't turn. The perfect silence had caused the electronic solenoids to lock in the closed position.
Oh, you want to play hard to get? Fine. I've got more leverage than you've got logic.
Miller looped a heavy steel chain around the wheel, then hooked the other end to a manual winch on the wall. She began to pump the winch handle. The gears groaned. The chain tightened until it was humming like a guitar string. The iron wheel began to shudder. A tiny hiss of air escaped. From the hallway, she heard the clicking of Valari feet. They had heard the noise. They were coming for the hub. Miller looked at the winch, then at the door. She didn't have a gun. She only had her tools.
Sarge, if you can hear me over the radio, forget it. You can't hear me. Just hope you're making a bigger mess than I am.
She grabbed a can of industrial degreaser and a roll of duct tape. As the first Valari soldier stepped through the door, his energy blade glowing, Miller wasn't hiding. She had rigged the degreaser can to a steam vent using the tape and a piece of wire. As the alien raised its weapon, Miller pulled the wire. The steam vent hissed, catching the spray of the degreaser and turning it into a localized, pressurized cloud of flammable mist. Then she flicked her Zippo and threw it. A localized whoosh of fire filled the doorway. Not a sophisticated plasma burn, but a raw, hungry chemical flame. The Valari soldier, encased in his clean armor, recoiled in terror. To the hegemony, fire was a controlled tool, a laboratory phenomenon. They had forgotten the primal fear of a burning cave. While the aliens scrambled back, Miller gave the winch one final desperate pump. The iron wheels spun. A deep, resonant roar filled the pipes as life-giving oxygen began to flood back into the station's ventilation system. The air grew sweet and thick.
Suck on that, you glowing toothpicks. That's 21% oxygen delivered by hand.
Miller leaned against the vibrating pipes, her chest heaving, her hands shaking. She looked at the dead Valari drone, then at her grease-stained wrench. The high-tech invaders had tried to turn off the world, but they had forgotten that humans were the ones who had invented the world of shadows, and they were very comfortable working in the dark. Chapter 4. The Copper Crown. The bridge of Station 88 was a cavern of dead glass and silent consoles. Outside the massive viewports, the Valari fleet hung like silver needles in the void, waiting for the signal that the station had been cleansed. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, rhythmic thump-thump of the diesel generator Miller had jump-started 2 levels below. Exarch-Val stood alone by the captain's chair, his 4 arms trembling. His soldiers were gone, some dead, some scattered in the steam-filled corridors. He was the master of 1,000 worlds of light, yet he was being hunted in the dark by a creature that smelled of grease and gunpowder.
Enough! Show yourself, ape-man. Do you think a few lead pellets can stop the weave?
Val's voice was high and brittle, echoing off the cold metal walls. He held a small, crystalline sphere in his upper right hand. It pulsed with a sickening ultraviolet light. This was the neural shatter, a weapon that bypassed armor and bone to vibrate the water molecules in a biological brain until they boiled. It was the ultimate clean weapon. From the shadows of the tactical station, a heavy boot stepped into the light. Sergeant Thorne was there, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. He looked exhausted. His canvas jacket was torn, and blood from a shallow cut on his forehead was drying in the soot on his face. He wasn't running. He was walking, slow and deliberate.
You talk too much, Val. In my world, if you're gonna kill someone, you don't give a speech first.
Thorne said, his voice a dry rasp. He stopped 10 feet away from the Exarch. He didn't raise a weapon. He just stood there, his arms hanging loosely at his sides.
You are arrogant because you have not seen real power. This is the end of your primitive thoughts.
Val screamed. He crushed the crystalline sphere. A wave of invisible, high-frequency energy erupted from his hand, a ripple in reality that turned the air purple. It hit Thorne full force. In any other circumstance, the sergeant's brain would have turned to gray sludge in seconds. The Valari watched, expecting the human to collapse, his eyes melting, his heart stopping. But Thorne didn't fall. He didn't even blink. He just kept walking. Thump, thump, thump.
Impossible. The frequency. It is tuned to your biology. Your neural pathways should be shattered. Why are you still standing?
The Exarch's filaments turned a pale, sickly white. He backed away, his boots clicking frantically on the deck. He looked at Thorne as if he were a ghost, a monster that defied the laws of the universe. Thorne reached up and tapped the side of his heavy, battered helmet. It wasn't the sleek, sensor-filled visor of a modern soldier. It was an old EOD bucket, reinforced with a fine, hand-woven mesh of burnished copper.
It's called a Faraday cage, Val. A trick from the 1800s. Simple copper mesh. Your neural shatter is just fancy radio waves, and radio waves can't get through a grounded cage.
Thorne leaned in closer, the shadows of the bridge making his eyes look like deep pits. The copper mesh on his helmet glinted like a primitive crown.
That's the low-tech paradox, Val. You built a world so advanced that a piece of wire and some basic physics can break it. You made yourself a god of the digital age, but you forgot how to fight a man with a hammer.
Val lunged, his forearms reaching for Thorne's throat, his elegant fingers ending in razor-sharp ceramic claws. Thorne didn't use his gun. He dropped his shoulder and drove his entire weight into the alien's chest. The impact sounded like a hammer hitting a crate of dry sticks. Val gasped, his translucent skin bruising instantly. Thorne grabbed the Exarch by the front of his shimmering robes and slammed him onto the command console. The dead glass cracked under the pressure.
You turned off our computers. You turned off our lights. You thought that made us weak.
Thorne growled, his face inches from the aliens. The smell of the sergeant's sweat and the acrid scent of the diesel generator seemed to overwhelm the Valari's senses.
But we didn't start in the light, Val. We started in the mud. We started with fire and stones. All you did was take away our distractions. Now it's just us, a dark room and the weight of history.
Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy analog detonator, a simple plunger connected to a spool of copper wire that led out the bridge door and down into the station's core.
What are you doing? You will destroy the station.
Val choked out, his eyes wide with a very primitive terror.
No, I'm just giving your fleet a reason to leave. They're waiting for a digital signal, right? Well, I'm about to send them an analog one.
Thorne looked at his mechanical watch. The second hand ticked forward with a steady, physical snick.
Time's up, Exarch. Miller, pull the pin.
From the intercom, not the digital one, but a simple copper wire sound tube Miller had rigged through the ventilation, came a muffled, "Roger that, Sarge!" Far below, the station's emergency vents began to scream. Thorne pushed the plunger down. There was no digital countdown, no access-granted screen, just the physical completion of a circuit and the roar of a world coming apart at the seams. Chapter 5. The Weight of History. The analog signal Thorne had promised wasn't a broadcast. It was a physical tremor that shook Station 88 to its very foundation. In the deep mining levels, Tech Private Miller had ignored the computerized magnetic rails and gone straight to the emergency steam ejection pistons, massive ironclad cylinders designed to clear jammed ore from the primary shafts. She hadn't loaded them with refined minerals. She had loaded them with raw, jagged blocks of unrefined iron ore, each the size of a ground car. Outside, in the silent theater of the void, the Valari fleet sat in perfect, geometric formation. Their sensors were tuned to detect the ignition of fusion drives, the shimmer of warp spools, or the high-energy signature of railgun capacitors. They were looking for ghosts in the machine. They were not looking for cold, dark rocks flying through the vacuum at 3 kilometers per second, propelled by nothing more than the expansion of superheated water vapor.
Warning. Impact imminent. Source. Unknown. Detection. Null.
The bridge of the Valari flagship erupted in chaos. The automated defense grids, the pinnacle of galactic engineering, sat idle. Their logic gates were waiting for a target to lock onto, but there was no heat to lock onto, no radar signature to track. The iron slugs were as dead as the vacuum itself. The first block of iron struck the flagship's secondary spire. There was no explosion, only the terrifying silent physics of kinetic energy. The elegant, pearlescent hull didn't melt, it shattered. The spire was sheared off cleanly, tumbling away into the darkness, spilling shimmering blue atmosphere and Valari bodies like dust in the wind.
Retreat. Break formation. The humans are using the debris as a weapon. How are they aiming? There is no targeting data.
The fleet commander shrieked over the hive mind weave, but the perfect silence they had deployed was now their own executioner. They had jammed the sector so thoroughly that their own ships couldn't coordinate a defense. They were blind, deaf, and being pelted by the very bones of the station they came to conquer. Back on the bridge of Station 88, Sergeant Thorne stood over Exarch Val. The alien was trembling, his forearms clutched to his chest. He watched through the viewport as his invincible fleet broke formation in a blind panic, fleeing from primitive rocks.
How are we aiming, you ask?
Thorne said, answering the question Val hadn't even managed to voice. He pointed to a small brass device mounted on the edge of the viewport. It was a simple optical sextant, a tool used by sailors on Earth's oceans 500 years ago.
Miller's got a telescope and a stopwatch. I've got a grease pencil and a bit of geometry. No computers required, Val. Just a steady eye and a lot of math.
Thorne reached down and hauled the Exarch to his feet. He led him to the airlock, the heavy manual door already cranked open by Miller. A small, unpowered survival pod, essentially a metal box with an oxygen tank, was waiting.
Go back to your hegemony. Tell them what happened here. Tell them that the perfect silence works both ways.
Thorne shoved the Exarch into the pod. He looked the alien in the eye one last time, his gaze as hard as the iron slugs he'd just launched.
You forgot the most important rule of the galaxy, Val. You can take away a man's power, you can take away his lights, and you can take away his logic, but you can't take away his grit. We've been surviving in the dark since we lived in caves, and we're real good at finding our way back to the sun.
Thorne slammed the pod's heavy mechanical latch home and pulled the manual release lever. The pod hissed as it was pushed out into the void, drifting toward the retreating Valari fleet.
Sarge, oxygen's back to 80%. Gravity's still a bit wonky, but the generator is purring like a kitten.
Miller's voice echoed through the sound tube. She appeared in the bridge doorway a moment later, wiping her hands on an even greasier rag. She looked around at the dark, shattered bridge and smiled.
Cleaned 'em out, didn't we? All that fancy light, and they couldn't handle a bit of rust and a heavy swing.
Thorne didn't answer right away. He walked over to the captain's chair and sat down, the metal groaning under his weight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key. He inserted it into the side of his mechanical watch and began to turn it. Click, click, click. The sound was small, but in the silence of the station, it was the most powerful sound in the universe. It was the sound of something that didn't need permission to exist.
They made a mistake, Miller. They thought the universe was a calculation. They thought if they solved the equation, they won.
Thorne looked up, watching the last Valari ship jump to warp, fleeing from the ghosts of Station 88.
But humans, we aren't an equation. We're a paradox. The more you try to simplify us, the more complicated we get. They built a god of light, but they forgot that every light casts a shadow, and that's where we live.
He finished winding the watch and checked the time. The second hand began its steady, rhythmic march once more. Thorne leaned back, the smell of diesel and cold iron finally feeling like home.
It's 1900 hours, Miller. Get the coffee going on the engine block. We've got a station to repair.
Dine, as the sun of the Sol Rim slowly began to peek over the edge of the station, illuminating the scarred hull and the clouds of iron dust, the truth of the encounter was clear. The Valari had brought the future, but the humans had brought the weight of history. And in a fight between a shimmering dream and a heavy hammer, the hammer always wins. Humanity doesn't need to be advanced to be superior. They just need to be unbreakable.